So once again, this is the 11th annual Air Quality and Health Workshop presented by the British Columbia Lung Association. My name is Veda Peters, and I'm here with Dr. Alan Robinson from Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania has some experience with some of the issues that we're talking about. So, what key air pollutants have been associated with fossil fuel extraction, processing, and transportation, since that's our topic?
Yes, so there are a number of different important air pollutants, and I guess thinking about it from a regulatory perspective, I think ozone is the most important criteria pollutant. So this is a pollutant that the ambient concentrations are regulated. And ozone isn't emitted by these activities, but it forms in the atmosphere from other emissions, so volatile organic compounds or oxides of nitrogen emissions. So these activities, oil and gas extraction, emit a lot of VOCs and a lot of oxides of nitrogen that go in the atmosphere and react and form ozone. And that's a pollutant that we've had a really hard time getting our arms around in terms of getting the levels down. And so I think that is one of the particularly important ones, or the impact of those activities on ozone levels.
So given that you need sunlight to form ozone, and we have as much rain as we do, is this going to be less of a factor for us?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think there have been some surprises around ozone in oil and gas. And so if we look to the state of Wyoming, which is a pretty rural state. Of course, it's a pretty sunny state. And so this part of British Columbia is pretty sunny. I don't have a good sense of what the rest of it is like, but certainly in Wyoming where it is pretty sunny, but ozone is typically formed in the summertime. Yes. But there, actually, the ozone episodes are in the winter. And so this was sort of unanticipated, and that's because it was this convergence of meteorological conditions creating like a low boundary layer, intense sunlight in the winter reflecting off the snow, in generating very high levels of ozone in a rural place. And Wyoming had never been out of attainment for ozone ever before until just recently. And so I think we need to be cautious about, I think if there's no sunlight, you need sunlight to make it go, yeah. but others. So anyway, so that's the ozone. I think there's some other pollutants that are potentially of a concern as well. I think there's some air toxics that people are worried about, so that's a different category of pollutants.
And what would the impact of these emissions be relative to other sources?
Well, I think, so thinking back to ozone, if we look about volatile organic compounds or oxides of nitrogen, it's not like gas-related activities are going to overwhelm all the other sources, right? They're cars and trucks, the power plants, all these things are important sources. If you look at the inventories of places, where you've compiled all the emissions together for places that have oil and gas in Texas or the Marcellus area where I'm from, the gas activities are comparable to one of these other big sectors. So when you make a pie chart that's got 4 or 5 different sort of pieces, it's kind of comparable to some of those other pieces. So it's significant. It doesn't overwhelm it, but it's significant. Okay,
my next question is, what's the fate of these emissions? So I guess that means what's their end?
So we just were talking about that. So in terms of oxides of nitrogen and VOCs, the fate is, they react in the atmosphere and make ozone is one of the things that they do. And so we've already sort of talked about that transformation. I think that's probably the biggest one. Obviously, if it's NOx, you can get acid gases from NOx emissions to make, acidification of lakes and things like that.
And health impacts, therefore?
Yes, and then they have health impacts as well. And so they get transformed chemically in the atmosphere, sometimes creating more toxic pollutants like ozone or formaldehyde as a secondary pollutant, and then those will impact human health and things like that.
So there are approaches available to minimize the impact?
There is. And so I think, obviously over the last 30 years or whatever, we've developed a lot of ways to control air pollutant emissions. And the nice thing about this sector is a lot of the devices that are used, compressors or diesel engines or these various things, are used in other sectors. And so we have experience with them about how to try to control them. And so there are technologies. So for oxides of nitrogen, you can use something like selective catalytic reduction is a SCR is a technology that works. This is deployed widely in on-road diesel vehicles. So it's not like it's some big step to put it in on an off-road truck that's used in the oil and gas industry, but you need to make that decision. I mean, the technology is there. We know how to do it. It's a matter of making the decision.
So the technology is there, but is it expanding?
In certain areas it is. I mean, I'm not as familiar with Canada, so say we were talking about the high ozone levels in the upper Green River Basin, which is a very rural part of Wyoming, that they have required putting these technologies on compressor stations and other facilities.
Are there gaps in the knowledge that exists?
In terms of controlling emissions?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's always, I'm an academic, right? So there's always more that we can learn. I think, I think that what would I say the gaps are? I think the gaps on emissions, I think part of the nature of the problem is that what I classify as a high emitter problem. And so it's like gasoline vehicles, right? That 10% of the vehicles emit 80% of the pollutants. And that's the smoking vehicle you see, it's not working properly because a vehicle that's working properly has very, very low emissions. And this is a problem in on-road vehicles, but it's a problem in the oil and gas sector as well, in my opinion. If you look at the data, it's suggestive of this. And essentially that there's a subset of the facilities that aren't operating correctly. For whatever reason, there's a broken valve or this or that, and there's very high emissions. And so how do we go about detecting those efficiently, finding those and fixing them? Because the work that's been done suggests that often it's not something that's too complicated to fix, but the challenge is finding those. And so I think in terms of the science, it isn't necessarily control technologies like some widget to put on the tailpipe. I think what's really needed is this, how do we do this assessment? A lot of this development is occurring in areas that hasn't been traditionally monitored. So you don't have a lot of baseline data. It's going to be very expensive to go put in monitors there, and that's not necessarily realistic. And so can we use satellite data or something like that to assess exposures? It may not be as good as ground-based, but it might be a lot cheaper. And I think that we need to think about that. And then the other is I think we really need to think about this high emitter problem. How can we go identify these efficiently so that we can apply our resources the most effectively to control the sources that are really causing the problem? And so thinking about strategies to do that. So from my perspective, those are the big challenges.
Sounds as if you're not going to be out of work for a while.
No, well, I mean, we're always looking for that next research problem, right?
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Robinson.
Great.